Late August 1944. The German army is in a desperate retreat across France, and the road to the German border seems wide open. Yet suddenly, General George S. Patton's relentless armored columns, the spearhead of the Allied advance, grind to a complete halt. They aren't stopped by a brilliant German counterattack. They aren't broken by hidden anti-tank guns or fortified lines. They are stopped because they have simply run out of gas. One of the most powerful, heavily mechanized armies in the world is physically paralyzed on the battlefield, its tanks reduced to useless steel bunkers, sitting silently on the roadside. For the German High Command, this sudden paralysis was not a surprise. It was the exact scenario they had calculated, predicted, and desperately prayed for since the Allied landings in June. The core of their defensive strategy rested on a fundamental law of modern warfare. A rapidly advancing army will eventually outrun its own supply lines and choke on its own momentum. By late August, that breaking point had arrived. The supreme irony of this moment was that the gasoline the Third Army desperately needed actually existed. Millions upon millions of gallons of it sat safely in massive, overflowing depots back on the beaches of Normandy. But distance is the ultimate enemy of logistics. For an American tank commander stranded several hundred miles away in eastern France, staring at an empty gauge, fuel in Normandy might as well have not existed at all. By August 28th, Patton's forces were short nearly 100,000 gallons of their daily operational requirement. 3 days later, the fuel flow practically ceased, leaving a massive portion of his army immobilized for nearly a week. The trap had sprung. The American war machine had broken down under the sheer weight of its own rapid success. But the central mystery of this story isn't just how the Americans stumbled into this massive logistical nightmare. The real question is far more revealing. When Germany was finally handed the exact operational crisis they had been waiting months for, why were they completely unable to capitalize on it? To understand how an army backed by the greatest industrial base on Earth could simply run out of fuel mid-stride, you have to look past the sheer volume of supplies and focus instead on the brutal, unforgiving friction of distance. The crisis that gripped Patton's Third Army in late August 1944 was born, paradoxically, out of its own spectacular success during the weeks prior. The initial Allied breakout from the Normandy beachheads in late July, spearheaded by Operation Cobra, shattered the German defensive lines far faster and more decisively than anyone at Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force had planned for. The original, highly methodical logistical blueprints assumed a slow, grinding advance across France. Planners had anticipated reaching the Seine River, roughly 130 miles from the invasion beaches, by early September, or D+90. Instead, Allied armor was crossing the Seine weeks ahead of schedule. Patton's forces, unleashed into the French interior, were not methodically pushing a solid line forward. They were racing across the map, covering dozens of miles a day in a fluid, relentless pursuit of a disintegrating enemy. This velocity was a tactical dream, but a logistical nightmare. Every mile gained exponentially increased the strain on the men trying to keep the tanks moving. The fundamental problem was no longer whether the fuel, ammunition, and rations existed on the continent. By August, the massive artificial harbors and captured ports in Normandy were pushing thousands of tons of materiel ashore daily. The depots were bursting. The true bottleneck was the physical impossibility of hauling that mountain of supplies forward to combat units that were sprinting ever further away. In a normal European theater of war, an army moving at this pace would rely heavily on the extensive French railway network to move the vast bulk of its heavy freight. Trains are the lifeblood of industrial warfare. A single freight train can carry the equivalent cargo of hundreds of heavy trucks. But in August 1944, that option simply did not exist. For months prior to D-Day, the Allies had waged a massive, systematic, and highly effective strategic bombing campaign designed specifically to cripple the French rail system. The goal had been to isolate the Normandy battlefield and prevent the Germans from moving reinforcements by train. They succeeded brilliantly. Rail yards were pulverized, bridges dropped, tracks twisted into useless metal ribbons, and locomotives destroyed. Now, as the Allies broke out, they were victims of their own destructive success. The very railway network they desperately needed to sustain their rapid advance lay in ruins behind them. American engineers were working frantically to repair the tracks, but laying new rail and rebuilding heavy bridges is slow, painstaking work. It could not keep pace with Patton's tanks. With the rail lines out of commission, the entire impossible burden of supplying the rapidly advancing armies fell squarely onto the shoulders of the motorized transport units. Everything, every bullet, every K-ration, and crucially, every drop of gasoline had to be driven forward in trucks over hundreds of miles of French roads. This created a terrifying mathematical reality, a phenomenon that logisticians call the trap of distance. It isn't a simple linear equation. When the front line moves 50 miles further away from the supply depots, the supply trucks don't just drive 50 extra miles. They have to drive 50 miles there and 50 miles back. That's an extra 100 miles added to every single trip. And here is where the trap snaps shut. To drive those extra 100 miles, the supply trucks themselves have to burn gasoline. As the distance from the Normandy beaches stretched from 100 miles to 200 miles to 300 miles, the efficiency of every truck plummeted. A 2.5-ton cargo truck hauling gasoline to the front was burning a significant portion of its own payload just to make the round trip. The longer the journey, the more fuel the delivery vehicle consumed, meaning less net fuel actually reached the tanks waiting at the front. To offset this diminishing return, the Army needed more trucks. But adding more trucks to the route meant adding more engines that needed gasoline, more tires that would wear out on the rough roads, more parts that would break, and more drivers who needed their own rations. It was a vicious, self-consuming cycle. The very act of attempting to push supplies further into France was eating away at the total volume of supplies available. The logistical planners watched the map with mounting dread. They could trace the lines of advance extending deeper and deeper into France, and they could calculate the diminishing returns of their truck fleets. The tension was agonizing. The combat commanders, seeing the disorganized German retreat, were screaming for more fuel to keep pushing, demanding to exploit the momentum before the enemy could recover. They saw open roads leading to the German border, but the supply officers saw a rubber band stretching past its structural limit. They knew the math. They knew that the current system of hauling everything by truck over increasingly vast distances was not just inefficient, it was fundamentally unsustainable. The strain on the vehicles was immense. Trucks designed for manageable regional hauling were now running cross-country marathons. They were being driven hard, often overloaded, over roads battered by years of war and recent combat. The friction of distance was grinding the American supply chain down to the bone. The system hadn't broken yet, but it was shuddering violently under the impossible load. The rapid advance of the combat units was actively tearing the logistical tail apart. It was only a matter of days, perhaps hours, before the stretching supply lines finally, inevitably, snapped. That inevitable snap finally echoed across the front lines in the last week of August. The mathematical reality that the supply officers had been dreading suddenly materialized in the fuel gauges of M4 Sherman tanks racing toward the Meuse River. On August 28th, the crisis hit Patton's Third Army with the force of a physical blow. That day, the rapidly advancing Spearhead received its daily fuel allocation, and the numbers were devastating. They were short nearly 100,000 gallons of their absolute minimum requirement. It wasn't a gradual slowdown. It was a sudden, violent deceleration of an entire field army. Armored columns that had been slicing through disorganized German resistance at 30 miles a day began to cough, sputter, and die on the narrow French country roads. Tank commanders, who had been eagerly studying maps of the German border, were suddenly forced to order their drivers to pull over and shut down their engines. But August 28th was only the beginning of the nightmare. The logistical pipeline, stretched across hundreds of miles of battered asphalt, had effectively run dry. The situation deteriorated with terrifying speed. By August 31st, the fuel supply reaching the forward elements of the Third Army dropped to essentially zero. The sheer scale of the paralysis was staggering. A massive portion of one of the most lethal, highly mechanized fighting forces on the planet was completely immobilized, effectively rooted to the ground for roughly 5 days. The predicted logistical collapse was no longer a theoretical risk debated by staff officers moving pins on a map back in London or Washington. It was a hard, undeniable reality playing out in the dust and mud of eastern France. The unstoppable American offensive, the juggernaut that had broken out of Normandy and sent the Wehrmacht reeling, was dead in its tracks. This silent, paralyzed front line was exactly what the German High Command had been desperately hoping to see. For weeks, they had been retreating in chaos, unable to establish a cohesive defensive line against the relentless speed of the American armor. Now, suddenly, the pressure vanished. The grinding halt of Patton's tanks handed the shattered German divisions a miraculous, golden window of opportunity. It gave them the most precious resource in modern warfare: time. Time to stop running. Time to regroup their scattered infantry, pull their surviving panzers back to defensive positions, and begin manning the formidable concrete bunkers of the Siegfried Line along the German border. The opportunity to launch a devastating counterattack against the stalled, vulnerable American spearheads was suddenly sitting right in front of them. For the American commanders, the silence on the front was terrifying. They knew their armored columns were sitting ducks, stranded far from their bases with empty fuel tanks and dwindling ammunition. They were acutely aware that if the German military machine realized the true extent of this paralysis, the hunter would instantly become the hunted. A desperate, frantic scramble erupted behind the American lines. They had to find a way to shove a massive injection of fuel across hundreds of miles of hostile territory immediately before the enemy could turn around and exploit the exact crisis they had been waiting for. The solution was not a brilliant, meticulously planned strategic masterstroke. It was an act of sheer, unadulterated logistical panic. On August 23rd, as the fuel gauges in the forward armored divisions began plunging toward empty, a frantic 36-hour emergency meeting was convened in Paris by the officers of the advanced section of the communications zone. They were tasked with solving an impossible mathematical equation: move tens of thousands of tons of supplies from the Normandy beaches to the front line across hundreds of miles of ruined infrastructure before the entire Allied offensive collapsed. Their answer was an improvised brute force convoy system that would become legendary, but which was, in reality, a chaotic, self-consuming machine operating permanently on the edge of disaster. They called it the Red Ball Express. To build this emergency pipeline overnight, the American command had to cannibalize its own military infrastructure. You cannot simply conjure thousands of heavy cargo trucks out of thin air. To get the vehicles required to feed Patton's stranded tanks, the Army ruthlessly stripped transport from almost every other critical unit in the theater. Anti-aircraft battalions had their prime movers confiscated. Heavy artillery units watched their supply trucks being driven away. Infantry divisions in the rear were suddenly grounded, stripped of their organic transport. If a vehicle had wheels, an engine, and a cargo bed, it was commandeered, painted with a crude red circle on the bumper, and thrown into the supply line. Military police immediately commandeered 2 parallel French highway systems, primarily Route N12 and Route N82, stretching from the beachheads deep into the French interior. They closed these roads to all civilian traffic and all other military convoys, creating a massive, closed-loop, one-way racetrack. The northern route was strictly for loaded trucks racing east toward the front. The southern route was for empty trucks racing west back to the beaches to reload. But immediately, the creators of the Red Ball Express ran into the very logistical trap they were trying to escape. To haul gasoline across France, the convoy system had to burn gasoline. The primary workhorse of the fleet, the GMCCCWK 2.5-ton truck, was a marvel of industrial engineering. But heavily loaded and driven continuously, it achieved perhaps 4 to 8 miles per gallon. As the route extended past 200 miles, the math became terrifying. At its peak, the Red Ball Express was consuming roughly 300,000 gallons of fuel every single day just to keep its own trucks moving. The delivery system was drinking a massive percentage of the very lifeblood it was supposed to be delivering to the combat units. To deliver enough fuel to break Patton's paralysis, the Americans had to throw an absurd, almost unsustainable amount of resources onto the road, accepting a staggering rate of waste simply to force a net gain of gasoline to the front lines. Yet, a truck is only as effective as the human being behind the wheel, and the human reality of the Red Ball Express is a story of extreme endurance hidden behind the machinery. The burden of saving the American offensive fell squarely onto the shoulders of the quartermaster truck companies. In the rigidly segregated United States Army of 1944, nearly 75% of these drivers were young African-American soldiers. Routinely denied the opportunity to serve in frontline combat infantry units due to institutional racism, these men were relegated to service, supply, and stevedore battalions. Suddenly, the entire momentum of the European war rested completely in their hands. Many of these men had not been adequately trained for the specific nightmare they were thrown into. Some had only received basic driving instruction before being handed the keys to a 6x6 heavy military truck, loaded to the breaking point with highly volatile aviation fuel or high explosive artillery shells, and told to drive continuously until they reached the front. The official regulations of the Red Ball Express dictated a strict order. Trucks were to travel in tightly controlled convoys, maintain a distance of 60 yards between vehicles, and never exceed 25 miles per hour. In the desperate reality of the French highways, every single one of those rules was instantly shattered. The pressure from the front was too immense. Drivers routinely reached under the hoods of their vehicles and disabled the engine governors, mechanical devices designed to restrict top speed, so they could push their heavily laden trucks to 40, 50, or even 60 miles per hour. They drove bumper to bumper to draft off the vehicle ahead and keep the convoys tight. They drove in shifts that stretched past human endurance, often operating a vehicle for 36, 48, or even 72 hours, with only scattered moments of sleep snatched in the cab while the truck was being loaded or unloaded. The most agonizing trial was the night. To avoid the theoretical threat of German aircraft and to maintain the relentless flow of supplies, the convoys drove through the absolute pitch black of the French countryside without headlights. They relied on cat eyes, tiny, heavily hooded slits of light that projected a faint, narrow beam only a few feet ahead of the bumper, invisible from the air but nearly useless for navigating a winding, debris-strewn country road at high speed. The sensory deprivation was absolute. Drivers stared endlessly at the glowing red taillight of the truck immediately in front of them, fighting a hypnotic exhaustion that clouded their minds. The invisible enemy of sleep deprivation took a terrifying toll. Hallucinations were common. Drivers would violently swerve to avoid imaginary buildings or non-existent people in the road. In extreme cases, a co-driver would have to slide behind the steering wheel and swap seats with an exhausted driver, while the heavy truck was still hurtling down the highway in the dark, simply because stopping meant delaying the convoy. The roads became exceptionally dangerous. If a driver nodded off for even a fraction of a second, a 2.5-ton truck carrying tons of gasoline would drift off the narrow asphalt and roll violently into a French ditch. There was a strict standing order for the convoys. You do not stop for a disabled vehicle. If a truck broke down or crashed, it was to be pushed out of the way immediately. The mission superseded the individual, and the relentless stream of traffic had to keep flowing past the wreckage of their own units. This brutal operational tempo initiated the third crisis of the American supply chain, the mechanical slaughter of the vehicle fleet. The trucks of the Red Ball Express were built tough, but they were not subjected to normal military use. They were subjected to sustained, calculated abuse. Under normal military protocols, a motor pool operates on strict preventative maintenance schedules. Daily checks of oil, transmission fluid, tire pressure, and greasing of joints are mandatory to keep a fleet alive. On the Red Ball route, preventative maintenance effectively ceased to exist. There was simply no time. A truck arrived at a depot, was violently unloaded, immediately reloaded, and sent back onto the road. Engines were kept running constantly. Furthermore, to maximize the tonnage delivered to the starving tanks at the front, the trucks were universally overloaded. The standard 2.5-ton rating was a guideline for rough, off-road terrain, but on the paved highways of France, supply officers routinely loaded the trucks with 5, sometimes 6 tons of heavy cargo. This massive excess weight transferred directly to the tires and the axles. On the jagged, bomb-cratered roads, dual rear tires heated up rapidly under the immense friction and shredded into useless strips of rubber. Axles bent and snapped. Transmissions, forced to haul twice their designed weight at maximum RPMs, tore themselves apart. Engines, starved of clean oil and pushed beyond their thermal limits, seized and died. The famous Red Ball Highway rapidly became an automotive graveyard. The shoulders of the road were littered with hundreds of abandoned, broken-down trucks, their hoods thrown open, waiting for salvation. The burden shifted to the ordnance maintenance companies, who were tasked with an impossible salvage operation. Mechanics worked around the clock on the side of muddy roads, operating under the dim glow of flashlights, desperately trying to swap blown engines and replace snapped axles. Because the supply chain for spare parts was just as delayed as the supply chain for fuel, mechanics resorted to ruthless cannibalization. They would strip a crashed or permanently disabled truck down to its chassis, taking its tires, its carburetor, its spark plugs, and its transmission, just to bolt those parts onto 2 other trucks to get them back into the convoy. The Red Ball Express was succeeding in forcing a trickle of fuel toward Patton, but it was actively eating itself alive in the process. The friction of the road was destroying the American transport fleet at a staggering rate. They were burning out thousands of tires a day. They were driving their machines until they literally fell apart under the drivers. The system was chaotic, terribly inefficient, inherently self-destructive, and relying entirely on the physical suffering of the men behind the wheel to bridge the gap that the planners had failed to anticipate. The logistical collapse had not been averted. It had merely been converted from a sudden stop into a grinding, desperate war of attrition against their own equipment. As this frantic, destructive drama unfolded behind the American lines, the question shifts to the east, across the front line. Where was the German counterattack? For the German High Command, the sudden screeching halt of Patton's Third Army in late August was the exact phenomenon they had banked on since the first boots hit the sand in Normandy. They understood the immutable laws of logistics just as well as the Allies. They knew the American advance could not outrun its ports forever. When the reports flooded into the headquarters of OB West, the German command for the Western Theater, that the American spearheads were sitting motionless with empty fuel tanks, vulnerable and disconnected from their rear echelons, it should have been the turning point of the campaign. According to classic German military doctrine, this was the precise moment for a massive Gegenangriff, a violent, concentrated, armored counterthrust designed to slice into the overextended, paralyzed enemy columns and shatter them before they could resupply. The strategic window had opened perfectly, but recognizing an opportunity and possessing the physical capability to exploit it are 2 entirely different things. When Field Marshal Walter Model, who had just been rushed to the Western Front to stabilize the collapsing situation, looked at his situation maps, the reality of the German position was catastrophic. The crisis they had hoped for had arrived, but it arrived roughly 2 weeks too late. To understand why the Germans could not attack, one must look at the butcher's bill of the previous month. In mid-August, the Allied armies had trapped and annihilated a massive portion of the German military within the Falaise pocket in Normandy. The German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army
had been ground to dust. They hadn't just lost tens of thousands of men. They had lost the mechanical foundation of their army. As the surviving German soldiers scrambled out of the collapsing pocket and fled eastward toward the Seine River, they were forced to abandon almost all of their heavy equipment. Thousands of German trucks, artillery pieces, half-tracks, and panzers were left burning in the Norman bocage. The devastating loss of transport meant that the once highly mobile German armored divisions were reduced to disorganized columns of exhausted infantry retreating on foot, relying on stolen bicycles, horse-drawn carts, and their own boots. Model did not have a mobile reserve waiting in the wings to launch a counterstroke against Patton. His panzer divisions were running on fumes, possessing only a handful of operational tanks each. They were suffering from a fuel crisis that made the American shortage look trivial. The German synthetic fuel industry was being systematically dismantled by Allied strategic bombers over the homeland. Even if a German commander could scrape together a battalion of tanks and gather enough precious gasoline to fuel them, he faced a completely insurmountable obstacle the moment he ordered his engines to start. The sky belonged exclusively to the enemy. The Allied tactical air forces, squadrons of British Typhoons and American P-47 Thunderbolts, roamed the skies over France with absolute impunity. They operated as airborne artillery, hunting anything that moved. The German army was effectively paralyzed during daylight hours. Any attempt to form up a counterattacking force, any convoy of supply trucks attempting to bring ammunition to the front, any column of panzers moving down a French road between sunrise and sunset was immediately spotted, strafed with heavy machine gun fire, and obliterated by rockets and bombs. The German forces were forced to hide in forests and barns during the day, moving only during the brief, terrifying hours of darkness. You cannot launch a rapid, coordinated, multi-divisional armored counteroffensive to exploit a temporary enemy fuel shortage when your own forces cannot legally step onto a paved road while the sun is shining. This was the supreme, tragic irony for the German military machine in late August 1944. Their overarching strategic calculation had been perfectly correct. The immense friction of distance had indeed broken the American logistical chain. The trap had worked. The American army had run itself into the ground, immobilized by its own rapid success. But the German command had drastically miscalculated their own capacity to survive the initial blows of the campaign. They had bled so heavily in Normandy and had lost so much of their own mobility that when the American weakness finally exposed itself, the Wehrmacht was physically incapable of raising a sword to strike. They saw the open flank. They knew Patton's tanks were sitting silent and dry. But the German units were too battered, too slow, and too deeply suppressed by Allied air power to close the distance. Instead of turning to attack, Model's shattered divisions could only use the miraculous American pause to save themselves. They used the quiet days of late August not to assemble a striking force, but to continue their desperate retreat eastward, limping toward the German border, hoping to reach the concrete fortifications of the Siegfried Line before the American fuel pipeline reconnected. The war in France had temporarily stopped being a battle of tactics between two opposing armies, and had become a brutal, invisible race of logistics taking place far behind the front lines. On one side, exhausted American truck drivers were destroying their own vehicle fleet, burning immense amounts of fuel to force a trickle of gasoline forward, racing desperately to restart the engine of the Third Army. On the other side, the disorganized remnants of the German army were racing on foot, trying to build a defensive wall out of shattered units before those American tanks roared back to life. The entire outcome of the Western Front hung in the balance of this bizarre, paralyzed moment, waiting to see which side's broken system could patch itself together just a fraction of a second faster. As the desperate race unfolded behind the lines, the American command in Paris began analyzing the daily tonnage reports coming back from the Red Ball Highway. What they saw in the numbers
triggered a new kind of panic. The improvised convoy system was moving materiel, but it was hiding a fatal mathematical paradox. The very machine built to deliver gasoline had become an insatiable monster, consuming the exact resource it was desperately trying to transport. The problem was rooted in the unforgiving geometry of a stretching supply line. Every time a forward armored unit received enough gas to advance another 50 miles toward the German border, they unknowingly tightened the noose around their own logistics. Moving the front line 50 miles further east didn't just add 50 miles to the supply route. It forced every single cargo truck to drive an extra 100 miles round trip. To cover that additional distance, a heavy transport truck had to burn a significant portion of its own volatile payload. The longer the journey became, the less net fuel actually survived the trip to be poured into an empty tank at the front. It was a terrifying equation of diminishing returns. To make up for the fuel lost in transit, supply officers were forced to dispatch even more trucks. But putting more trucks on the road meant adding more engines that needed to be fed. Those additional vehicles burned more fuel, destroyed more rubber tires, required more spare parts, and demanded more drivers. It became a vicious, exponential death spiral. By the time the route stretched to its maximum limits, the sheer overhead of moving supplies had reached an absurd scale. At its absolute peak, the Red Ball Express was incinerating nearly 300,000 gallons of gasoline a day just to keep its own wheels turning. To put that staggering number into perspective, the delivery trucks were burning the equivalent daily fuel consumption of an entire active field army. That massive volume of fuel wasn't fighting the Germans. It was simply vanishing into the exhaust pipes along the French highways. This was the second, far more dangerous turning point of the crisis. The logistical planners stared at the maps and realized that their heroic improvisation wasn't curing the disease. It was actively accelerating the collapse. The harder they pushed the vehicle fleet to sustain the offensive, the faster the system cannibalized itself. The American war machine was essentially caught in logistical quicksand. Struggling violently only made them sink faster. They were burning through their mechanical advantage, sacrificing their transport infrastructure just to buy a few more miles of ground. The terrifying conclusion was undeniable. You cannot win an industrial war by endlessly driving trucks across a continent. If they didn't fundamentally change how they moved supplies, the Red Ball Express would end up paralyzing the Allied advance far more effectively than the German army ever could. The realization that the truck convoys were slowly destroying themselves forced American commanders to confront a bleak reality. They were literally driving their army to death. The Red Ball Express, conceived as an emergency adrenaline shot, was rapidly morphing into a terminal illness. The system was threatening to collapse entirely under the crushing weight of its own mechanical friction. The physical toll on the French highway network was becoming apocalyptic. The roads were simply not engineered to withstand the ceaseless, punishing impact of thousands of overloaded 6x6 military trucks pounding the asphalt 24 hours a day. Paved surfaces buckled and shattered under the immense tonnage, transforming smooth routes into jagged, crater-pocked obstacle courses that ripped suspensions apart and shredded dual rear tires faster than the rubber could possibly be replaced. The shoulders of Route N12 and Route N82 soon began to resemble linear junkyards. Every few miles, drivers passed the discarded carcasses of GMC and Dodge cargo trucks. Vehicles that had survived the treacherous night drives were now simply breaking down in broad daylight. Engines, choked with dust and starved of clean oil due to the total abandonment of routine maintenance schedules, were violently seizing and throwing rods straight through their cylinder blocks. Axles, forced to bear the weight of 5 or 6 tons of ammunition over ruined pavement, snapped like dry twigs. The maintenance battalions, originally designed to handle the routine wear and tear of a standard field army, were completely overwhelmed by the sheer volume of catastrophic mechanical failures.
Mechanics found themselves engaged in a frantic, losing battle of industrial triage on the side of muddy roads. Lacking the necessary volume of replacement parts because spare parts were sitting in the same delayed logistical pipeline as the fuel, they were forced to adopt a policy of ruthless cannibalization. A truck that blew an engine or suffered a bent frame was immediately descended upon and stripped bare. Mechanics ripped out its starter motor, salvaged its tires, and tore off its carburetor, simply to bolt those scavenged components onto 3 other dying trucks to force them back into the convoy. The motor pool was literally eating its own dead to keep the survivors moving. This mechanical slaughter meant that the total transport capacity of the theater was steadily shrinking every single day. As more trucks were abandoned on the roadsides, the impossible burden of moving the daily tonnage fell onto an increasingly smaller pool of surviving vehicles. To compensate, supply officers ordered the remaining trucks to be loaded even heavier and driven even harder, which only accelerated the rate at which those trucks failed. The sheer friction of distance was actively eating the Allied advance alive. The American military machine was trapped in a terrifying paradox, burning out its own vital organs in a desperate attempt to keep the spearhead moving. The crisis had fundamentally shifted. The immediate danger was no longer just about failing to reach the front lines. It was about the imminent internal destruction of the entire supply apparatus itself. If the grinding attrition continued at this pace, the Red Ball Express wouldn't just fail to deliver enough gasoline, it would cease to exist as a functional transport network, leaving the combat armies permanently stranded across the continent. The system had been pushed right to the absolute edge of catastrophic failure, but total collapse never came. The reason the American supply line didn't shatter in early September wasn't because they magically conjured more trucks out of the dust, or because their warehouses in Normandy were bottomless. The system survived because the Red Ball Express, for all its destructive chaos, was only doing one thing. It was violently buying time. While exhausted drivers were grinding their vehicles into scrap metal on the highways, another desperate race was unfolding right behind them. Army engineer battalions were frantically rebuilding the very railway infrastructure the Allies had just spent months bombing into oblivion. They were laying new steel tracks over blasted craters, raising destroyed bridges from riverbeds, and patching together captured French locomotives. This was the transition that saved the offensive. You can't sustain a mechanized army across a continent with cargo trucks, but you can with trains. A single freight train rolling out of a restored depot could haul the equivalent payload of several hundred heavy trucks, using a fraction of the fuel and 0 rubber tires. By early September, the sound of train whistles began echoing closer to the front. Every time engineers pushed a functioning railhead just a few dozen miles further east, it amputated a massive segment of the agonizing truck route. The impossible burden was finally being lifted off the bleeding highway and placed onto steel rails. This was the fatal blind spot in the German calculation. Their high command had perfectly diagnosed the fundamental law of industrial warfare. They knew an attacking army would inevitably choke on its own momentum, and they waited months for that exact paralysis to strike Patton's armor. But they fundamentally misunderstood what would happen next. They assumed that once the American supply chain hit its breaking point, it would simply snap and stay broken. What they failed to anticipate was the terrifying elasticity of their enemy. The true American advantage wasn't a frictionless war machine that never failed. It was the capacity to absorb a catastrophic breakdown, abandon a failing method, and reconstruct their entire supply network in real time, shifting the massive weight of the war from rubber to steel faster than the Wehrmacht could ever hope to strike. On August 31st, General George Patton's formidable Third Army really did grind to a silent, agonizing halt in eastern France, handing the German High Command the exact moment of paralyzing logistical collapse they had calculated for since the June landings. The American supply chain had finally snapped, leaving one of the world's most powerful mechanized forces completely stranded without fuel. Yet that silent battlefield ultimately proved that waiting for your enemy to make a fatal mistake means absolutely nothing if your own army has already lost the mobility, the time, and the armored reserves to make them pay for it.